Chapter 32, Section 2, A Nation Divided, Segregation in American Life. Racial segregation forced blacks to behave in certain ways. They were expected to accept their lesser status in society and act accordingly. W.E.B. Du Bois called this pattern of behavior living behind the veil. In private, or among other blacks, they acted normally. But around whites, they put on a mask, hiding their true feelings and acting meek and inferior. In practice, this meant that most blacks avoided looking white people in the eyes. When they spoke to whites, they looked at the ground. A black male could not look at a white woman or touch her accidentally. If charged with inappropriate attention to white females, a black male might face a lynch mob in many states throughout the nation. Blacks had to accept white insults and degrading names such as boy, girl, auntie, or uncle, regardless of their age. This code of rules and behavior was the product of a long history of racial discrimination in the United States. It was most evident in the South, but it extended throughout American society. Segregation and public accommodations. Segregation was common in public places, especially in the South. The segregation and public accommodations got a boost in 1896 when the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that railroad cars could be segregated as long as the accommodations were separate but equal. This ruling gave rise to many state laws legalizing segregation and public accommodations, including theaters, restaurants, libraries, parks, and transport services. Jim Crow laws established separate facilities for whites and blacks across the South. In waiting rooms and restrooms, train cars and buses, theaters and restaurants, and even on park benches, blacks and whites were kept apart. One state even passed a law requiring separate telephone booths. Often there was simply no accommodation for blacks at all. Some restaurants refused to serve African Americans. And in some places there was a bathroom for whites but none for blacks. In other cases, the facility for blacks was notably inferior. That was often the case with schools. Segregation in schools. Jim Crow laws for schools began to appear shortly after the Civil War. By 1888, school segregation had been established in almost every southern state, along with some northern and western states. Although the Plessy decision stated that separate accommodations for the races must be equal, the reality was often quite different. Southern states spent far more on white schools than on black schools. Teachers in black schools got lower salaries and worked under more difficult conditions. They often lacked books and supplies, and their school facilities were frequently substandard. In some schools, students had to gather firewood to heat their classrooms in the winter. Although white schools had bus systems, black students often had to walk miles to get to school. Segregation in housing. African Americans also experienced housing segregation. This came in two main forms. One was de facto segregation, which was established by practice and custom rather than law. This form was found in all parts of the country. The other was de jure segregation, or segregation by law. De jure segregation occurred mostly in the South. De facto segregation was common in many northern cities. When large numbers of African Americans began moving north in the 1900s, many white residents used informal measures to keep blacks out of their neighborhoods. One practice was the restrictive covenant. This was an agreement among neighbors not to sell or rent to African Americans or other racial minorities. Restrictive covenants often forced blacks into poor neighborhoods that were farther from jobs, public transport, or good schools. De jure segregation was accomplished through racial zoning. These school laws defined where the different races could live. In the 1930s and 1940s, the federal government supported racial zoning. In 1951, however, the Supreme Court declared racial zoning unconstitutional. Yet segregated neighborhoods remained the norm in many southern cities. Segregation in marriage. Between 1870 and 1884, 11 southern states passed laws against miscegenation, or interracial marriage. In the words of one historian, these were the ultimate segregation laws. They stated that blacks were inferior to whites and that any amount of racial mixing through marriage or childbirth threatened the purity of the white race. Some states outside the South also banned interracial marriage. Many laws against miscegenation prohibited marriage not only between African American and whites, but also between whites and Asians or whites and American Indians. Segregation in the workplace. Employment and working conditions reflected widespread segregation in American society. Few blacks held white-collar jobs, or jobs that do not involve manual labor. Those who did were usually teachers or ministers. Not many blacks were employed as skilled laborers either. Most worked in agriculture or services. Their wages were much lower than those of whites. In 1940, for example, the median income level of black men was less than half that of white men. Discrimination in employment was a direct result of racism, but it was also the product of poor schooling for African Americans. Illiteracy and a lack of education helped trap blacks in low-level jobs, especially in the South. Segregation and politics. Southern whites also found ways to disenfranchise or deny voting rights to African Americans. In the years after Reconstruction, poll taxes and literacy tests kept many blacks from voting. Many Southern states also disenfranchised blacks through the use of the white primary. This was a primary election in which only whites could participate. It was based on the domination of Southern politics by the Democratic Party, which Southern whites perceived as the opponent of radical Reconstruction and civil rights. The Democrats excluded blacks from party membership and thus denied them the right to vote in the party primaries. As a result, the Democrats had no need to court black voters, and blacks had no political representation. Texas was the one state in which the white primary was used extensively. Between 1923 and 1944, Texas Democrats used it to limit black participation in politics. In 1944, however, the Supreme Court declared white primaries unconstitutional. As a result, more African Americans began voting in Texas, and the number of registered black voters rose substantially. Gerrymandering was another method used to discriminate against black voters and render their votes meaningless. Gerrymandering is the practice of redrawing the lines of a voting district to give one party or group of voters an advantage. If the majority of voters in a particular voting district are African American, they may be able to elect a candidate who represents their interest. But if the voting district lines are gerrymandered to break up that population and place African Americans in white majority districts, the black vote gets diluted and becomes less effective. Through gerrymandering, black voters were often denied political influence. These methods were unlike the violent methods used in the early years after Reconstruction, when blacks were sometimes forcibly prevented from voting. But they were equally effective in denying blacks voting rights and limiting black representation in government.